Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, preparing to check in on a couple of my worm bins. I've got some information about them right here. There are a couple of systems which up until now I've always referred to them as the, kind of a weird way to refer to them, but I've referred to them as the bins with 60 days difference between their ages. Kind of a mouthful, right? So as of last week, here's the difference. The 60 days difference is one bin, the older is 290 days old, the younger 230 days old. So instead of that weird, kind of unusual way to refer to them, even though it's kind of late in the game, I figured I would give them a new branding, and I'm going to start calling them the odd couple. And it's really just because of the huge difference in their ages, almost 2 months difference in their ages. Only 10 days have passed since we last checked in on these little guys, and we have been gearing them up, mainly for the older bin, for the 290-day-old system. We've been gearing them up for migration and harvest. And they're the two systems, like I said, one of them is up here. They both have the red plastic coverings. The other one is right down there, the 230-day-old system. So we're going to get them up on the bench, and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. What we have for them today is strawberry, a whole bunch of frozen strawberry, and I've got my worm chow. The last feeding they got 10 days ago was coffee and pumpkin, stuff that after only 10 days I would have to assume is going to be, for the most part, gone. And with these older systems, I think some of the criteria for selecting foods for them is fast composting, unlikely to leave leftovers, and pumpkin and coffee definitely fit that bill, and I believe that strawberry does too. So let's clear off these coffee filters, because these usually serve as our feeding zone indicators, showing us where we last fed, and down the middle was where we last fed. And I've been debating whether we would want to continue that way or possibly do a somewhat different feeding style, which I've been doing in a couple of my other bins too, which is to not dig a trench and not submerge their food down the middle, but rather try to encourage worms to travel the entire system by spreading the food out over the entire top surface, in which case feeding zone indicator might be irrelevant, since basically the feeding will have been placed everywhere rather than just in one specific place, so no need to indicate it at that point. So let's start out just by taking a look here in the older of the two systems, the 290-day-old system, to see whether or not there's any leftovers of the pumpkin and coffee. I mean, the coffee we would probably have a hard time seeing if there was any leftovers, and if there were any leftovers of the pumpkin, it would probably be clearly visible because it would be orange in color. Eventually, when the pumpkin does get eaten, all the way to the point where it's just that very thin see-through outer skin of the pumpkin, the orange color no longer shows, but as long as there's still a little bit of the fleshy fruit or vegetable matter, whatever you want to think of it as, it might still show up. But you know, I think for all intents and purposes, I got corrected on that expression recently by one of my viewers, I would have to say that the pumpkin is basically gone. Something's going on down here, because these worms are definitely mobbing around something interesting that they found. And here and there we do find something like the shell of an avocado, I believe is what this might be. And I've just been throwing larger, slower composting objects of that sort over into the younger bin, where I believe there'll be a little bit more time for that sort of stuff to continue breaking down. So that has been our sort of routine with these two bins. Small particle size, fast composting foods, movement of any slow composting leftovers that we encounter along the way in the older one, getting moved over into the younger one. And I think by doing that over a few check-ins, we're going to set the stage for a really smooth harvest of these castings and extraction of the worms from the material to get them relocated. So we don't have to go too crazy hunting down every last little thing, but if I do bump into a little piece of avocado shell or maybe corn cob chunks or anything of that nature, we'll move them over. But I think another good thing is to sort of aerate the entire system. At this point, I would have to say that there's really no leftovers in the feeding zone. No leftovers of the last feeding, at least. Stuff like avocado shells, those are leftovers from feedings gone by, from the distant past at this point. If we hit a little piece of, leftover pumpkin, there's no need to move that over. That's going to be gone soon. So I think I like the idea of coming in here and really, putting in a little bit of extra effort just to get this older system ready for getting the worms relocated, harvesting the castings. And at that point, they won't really be an odd couple anymore. We'll detach the concept of these being buddied up anymore at that point and allow the older system to mature to the point where we can actually bring it to its conclusion. And then the younger bin can continue on. But either way, we've been doing a matched sort of feeding style. So the feeding that's really being geared more for the older system to help it hit the finish line soon is the same types of feedings and attention that the younger bin has been getting, with the exception of the slower composting materials getting placed over into the younger bin. And I think here and there another thing that we've been doing was any sort of materials that were going to be used as bedding. So like when we put those 2 coffee filters out here as our feeding zone indicators, last week we had been replacing 2 older ones that were repurposed to become bedding, and in that case we didn't place it in here as bedding, we placed both of them over there. I'm pretty sure that's the case. Or maybe I'm just getting this confused with another set of bins elsewhere, I'm not sure. And even though we've got a little bit more material, corn cob bits, chunks of avocado peel that we've been throwing over there, stuff that this system still needs to work down, and for that reason we would want to keep the moisture level a little bit higher over in the younger system so that it can continue working those types of materials down. I have thought about possibly doing one little twist over here and possibly changing from plastic coverings over here in the older system to a more porous, breathable paper-based top covering so that some of this material can begin drying off a little bit, help it become a little bit less clumpy and more easily flowing. Because I think that will also help eventually with the migration of the worms out of the material, if that were to become the way we decide to separate the worms from their castings. Because as the stuff starts to dry out, the worms will become interested in finding themselves a little bit more comfortable place to be, and then we would set up a migration feeding zone where there'd be abundant moisture for them to enjoy and food and stuff like that, and then over time they would start abandoning their old castings due to the dwindling moisture content. Because then too we would probably allow this stuff to continue to become drier and hopefully less interesting for the worms to remain in. So I definitely like that idea. I do believe that that's the way we're going to leave this system at the end of the day, which is with a more porous, a paper-based newspaper covering instead of replacing the plastic covers that were on here. And since that's the case, I think really quick, I do see a worm over here on the plastic cover. But since the plastic cover won't be coming back on here, I can definitely make sure I'm not leaving any wormies behind on it. So let's treat that as the prep for this system. And I do like the idea of sprinkling the foods out across the top surface, so why don't we do it that way? I think over here, why don't we remain consistent in the 2 bins from that perspective in terms of feeding them that way in both bins. And why don't we also remain consistent in the... Ooh, that was kind of cool. in the consideration of also kind of stirring through the entire system here too to aerate. And man, look at all these worms. Holy cow. Nice fun little worm ball here. Oops. Stay in your bin, guys. Stay in your bin. Yeah, sometimes I speed up the footage and stabilize it, but you know, I don't think I'm going to do that here. I think I'd really like to just sort of get through the aeration of the entire contents of the bin, get the food in here for them. Then I'm going to have to go find myself a nice replacement top covering for the older system. And at that point, we will begin, you know, making a greater effort to try to help the older bin make it to the finish line so we can start looking for that opportunity to eventually kick off the migration of the worms out of their finished castings. I mean, I think doing a light separation of that type of material when it's that damp and clumping would be extremely difficult. It wouldn't sift well. So it does seem to me like migration is the way to go. And in the process of the migration, the material will gradually get drier and drier and a little bit more manageable too. So here too, I think the only evidence of there having been a feeding zone down the middle besides the feeding zone indicator was the mob scene of worms that we encountered when we tilled up the center of the bin, which was pretty exciting to see. You know, one more time, why don't we just bring this information board back here, because you can see that there are estimates for the number of worms that live in both systems, and the younger system over here does seem to have a slightly larger population of worms, maybe by 150, 160 or so worms, not by much. And you got to remember, after all that time, the worms have probably been breeding and even expanding their numbers further, so I wouldn't be surprised if each system had over 3,000 worms living in it, but that's just an estimate, you never know. So yeah, why don't we proceed to dropping in their yummy feeding. We're going to be doing that top feeding approach, spreading the food out across the top surface. The strawberry's frozen. It's been in my freezer for some time now. Oops. So let's see about dishing it out in a fair way so both systems get an equal quantity. Well, it seems like there's a bit more here than it originally appears after you start chipping it apart from each other. I've been doing this top surface style feeding in a number of my bins, especially older systems where I really want the worms to not be focused in one central spot in a feeding zone, so to speak, but rather I want them occupying the entire system and working down the contents of the system everywhere, not just in the feeding zone. So I think this is a good way to get worms to be hanging out in all different sections of the bin rather than being concentrated. I believe my somewhat older original worm bins are set up the same way. And this really isn't a whole lot, but then again, it's only been 10 days since we last fed them. So it does seem like perhaps more frequent and somewhat smaller feedings. Let's not forget we've got worm chow too. Might be a good way to go, and not to mention the fact that with this system here, the older one, 290 days of age, only 10 days away from being 300 days of age. We like to try to recognize milestone dates in my worm bins, so perhaps we'll use that as an excuse to come back in here yet again 10 days from now to check in on them again. The couple of my systems that are actually in the process of migrating right now did actually initiate their migration out of their castings on day 300. I don't know if we're going to want to do that here. in the older bin, because they too will hit 300 days of age at that point. And we certainly could if we wanted to, but I don't know. Not sure if we're going to bother. I don't know. What do we do with the feeding zone indicators? Do we put them back in just for being consistent with our traditions? Especially in an older system like this with, you know, a real absence of bedding and carbon-based foods for them to nibble on. Perhaps it is a nice idea just to have something, a paper product in there if they decide they want to nibble on it. But again, if we put a, well, what did I just say? But then again, if we put a paper-based top covering onto the older system, then the top surface will tend to become a bit dry, and a piece of dry paper is not going to be of much interest to the worms as far as something to nibble on. So perhaps it's really, you know, going to be there for the only purpose of being sort of a sentimental thing, because it is tradition to have feeding zone indicators in my systems. Whatever, we'll stick to keeping it in here. And since I'm not prepared with a paper covering for the older system, I think I'll just leave the video at this. I'll take care of that as a to-do item for me to handle after the camera stops rolling. So I've got a few things to take care of. Top covering of paper, clean up and put away, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.